Have a great afternoon. We now move across to Minerals West Coast. Thanks, Mike. Patrick.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone on the select committee for making the time for me to speak on behalf of Minerals West Coast. I will have some slides to sort of aid my presentation, but just while we're waiting for those, I guess first and foremost, what I think this legislation should try and do with relevance to the mining industry, if you've got a digger bucket or a dozer blade and that's doing something in an area with biodiversity or freshwater values, whether that's constructing infrastructure, whether that's putting in renewable electricity infrastructure, power pylons, or if you're excavating a desired mineral from the ground, those impacts are going to be the same on biodiversity and fresh water. Where I think this particular legislation went wrong was that there are climate change objectives, and to use the RMA's freshwater and biodiversity provisions to attempt to take effectively a supply side approach to the country's fossil fuel supply as opposed to demand side approach like the emissions trading scheme or something like that, I think that's actually quite clumsy, disingenuous and cynical. If you wanted to constrain the country's coal or other fossil fuel production, you could use prohibitive measures under the Crown Minerals Act or something like that was actually honest and direct and transparent. But to do it this way, I think was wrong. But just to start with one of the slides, with one of the visuals that I included in our presentation, I just want to get a sense of proportion. So if you look at that graphic there, our coal emissions have been largely flat since the 1990s and have actually fallen if you measure them on a per capita basis. Because oil's directly linked to transport and transport's directly linked to the population growth that we've had, our oil emissions have gone up. But you will notice if you look at the 2019, 2020 area, due to the impact of the lockdowns in early 2020, our oil emissions actually fell. You'll see that our coal and gas emissions, because they were related to things like industry, they were critical services. So coal miners, along with supermarket workers and nurses, were going to work through the lockdowns because they were essential for the operations of the country. But I'll just move on to the next slide, if I may. And the reason I'm talking directly about this is because it's such a specific and such an anomaly within this legislation. So those visuals may not be particularly easy to see some of the colours, but the largest number, about 4.5 million tonnes on that graph in 2006, the highest line, that's New Zealand's total coal consumption. The next line, orange, is our subbituminous, or what people would colloquially refer to as thermal coal, which is used for dairy factories, freezing works, Genesis Energy, etc. Also NZ Steel. And you'll see that since about the early 2010s, that's been trending down, mainly due to diminishing production out of the Waikato coalfield. But you'll see that while its production has been trending down, the same has not happened with New Zealand's coal consumption. And the inverse line there, the green line, is New Zealand's coal importation. So if you are to constrict the country's coal supply, it does not follow that coal consumption will fall. The substitution effect is not immediately renewable electricity as people might desire it to be. It's imported fossil fuels from overseas. And the vast majority of New Zealand's fossil fuel actually comes from our ports. All of our transport fuels, for example, come from other countries. If a country needs an energy source and it's able to import it, it will continue to do so. So simply trying to strangle it or suffocate it by saying, oh, you can't get it out of wetlands or you can't get it out of SNAs, not only is that cynical lawmaking, it's simply not going to have the desired effect either. Just to move on to the next slide. So that's a rough breakdown. This is from MB's spreadsheets from 2023. New Zealand's coal use, which is at the bottom line there, that orange line at the bottom, the far right bottom, that's 1.9 million tonnes. So that was our coal consumption in 2023. Now we've averaged roughly 2 to 3 million tonnes over the past 30 years, and that's fluctuated depending on the hydro lake levels. And you'll see that all of the ones that I've highlighted there are the major users, whether it's dairy, whether it's meat processing, electricity generation, production of steel, non-metallic mineral products, things like cement, limestone, etc. Those aren't exactly luxuries and fancies that we just have. Those are essential things for the primary production within this country's economy. And what does that all look like? I'll just move to the last slide. So to sort of take this out of a spreadsheet and a graph and turn it into a real world context, that's my hometown, Hokitika, where I grew up. It's where I returned to about 5 years ago. And that large prominent building there that you can see is a dairy factory. Now that dairy factory relies on the use of coal, and it's going to for the foreseeable future. My next door neighbour, I went to school with his son, he's one of the boilermen down at the dairy factory, and he said his incentive to live to 2050 is to see what they're using that's not coal by the time we get to our zero carbon target. And fundamentally, if we don't have energy, we don't have industry. If we don't have industry, we don't have jobs. And if we don't have jobs, we don't have communities. And while that story applies to my hometown in Hokitika, that applies to many rural communities throughout the whole country. We basically produce pasture very competitively, we process it through a ruminant, and then we use energy to turn that into a product that we can export around the world. And that's the source of this country's prosperity and, you know, many communities up and down the North and South Island. So I allowed myself 5 minutes for this rant and I've already gone over it. So
Fantastic.
I'll open myself
I'm going to go
up
straight
for,
into a question.
I will open myself
Can
up
we
for
go
questions,
back on the
thank you.
slides to the clerk?
Yeah, I'm happy to offer any interpretation to any of those
Well,
slides as well.
I'm just cognizant of the issue between the green line and obviously import profiles.
Yep.
That has an emissions profile. Has anyone done the numbers on the emissions, not the burning of Indonesian coals, but the emissions due to transportation versus the counterfactual of pulling coal out of New Zealand? Because one forward, please, Gabor, if you'd be kind, sir. Yes. So the peak there is evidently, that is the profile of emissions from the use of coal versus the importation of coal.
Yes.
What is the profile difference? Has anyone sat down and done the numbers?
It's certainly higher emissions at a global level.
Do we know what they
you're
are,
getting at.
though?
Not specifically, but I can try and get those to you.
I think if we could extrapolate out what the actual emissions exercise of bringing in however many million tonnes of coal actually is.
It'll certainly be higher than getting it from just
Yes,
down the
but
road.
it'd be lovely to have a figure because, you know, there's science matters. And if we care about the environment, which I categorically believe we all do, and we are, for the sake of, and it's my words, being pious, perhaps, if we're importing the blessed stuff, we've got the stuff in the ground with a low emissions profile via extraction versus the transportation cost and its profile, that's backward logic.
To say nothing of the security concerns if anything kicks off in the Indo-Pacific
100%.
as well, but yeah, sorry.
On line farm.
Thank you for your submission. Just sort of a question of clarification.
Yes.
Because you're saying that you want to strengthen the bill to prevent councils to continue to classify SNAs.
Yes.
But then you're also saying that Minerals West Coast does acknowledge the importance of identifying SNAs, but you think that such areas should be restricted to the best of the best.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Are you concerned, or is West Coast Minerals concerned about our immense biodiversity loss across the country and the need for like building a resilient environment for the
completely.
future?
I mean, since humans arrived here 800 years ago, our biodiversity hasn't had a particularly good time, to put it mildly. But one issue with the SNA process is that if you look at the classification, I live in a suburban area of Hokitika, if there is such a thing, right? I've got Caprosma robusta and self-sown kikatea in my urban garden. Occasionally I get Kirarupi, Waka Waka and Weka in my garden. Now, that would be considered an SNA from my reading of this interpretation. On my parents' and, well, family grandparents' land south of the Hokitika River, we've got about a 22-hectare Kiwitu covenant on our land, which comprises several hundred-year-old Rimu and Kikatea podocarp forest. Now, those are both SNAs with no distinction drawn between the two among the legislation. And to say that they are of equal currency in terms of what matters within our biodiversity context, because the other thing that has to come into play here is the hierarchy of, you know, avoid, mitigate, offset, compensate, et cetera, et cetera. So there should be an avenue for development provided you can offset it somewhere else if you believe that that is possible to do. Yeah.
Very quickly.
It's just supplementary.
Very quickly.
So you're saying that your backyard is an SNA?
I think it would be under this legislation, yes, which I think is farcical.
You think it would be?
Yeah. I think
But it isn't?
No, well, I mean, it's a garden with grass on it and one or two self-sown native trees in it and some occasionally mobile fauna. But the other thing as well, biodiversity and freshwater systems on private land have a value. The issue that I have with the way that this is written is that there is a public benefit from protecting them that it is incurred at a private cost. My parents retired or sacrificed any economic value they could have got out of that land by setting it aside, and for no real benefit other than it made it a bit easier to do a subdivision, but that was because it was difficult to get it over the line with the local council. But the moral and the more effective thing to do, I think, would be to use mechanisms that already exist, like the Nature Heritage Fund and the QE2 process, which have been underfinanced for decades ever since they were established, to actually recognise that value economically in a way that's moral and fair for everyone. And I think would also get far more support from rural landowners as well, who feel a bit, if I may say so, put upon by the way that things are being done.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
fulsome remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Very fulsome. We now move across